Terrific. Well, I am just super excited to have folks here today at Spitfire U. We do Spitfire U's on a pretty regular basis. Sometimes they're just internal Spitfire skills and expertise sessions, and then sometimes the topic is just so compelling, we're like, let's invite all of our favorite people. And so Claire came up with the idea of really digging into art, communication, and advocacy, and having us think about this from a strategic place. So I am here to welcome you. I am Kristen, pronouns she and hers. I am the president of Spitfire Strategies. And today we have three guests who will help us explore the power of art in public movements. And I realized that when my team raised this issue, it is just so critically important. And I think about when I first got into the business, which was many, many, many years ago, in the early 90s, it was really when the world was talking about South Africa and apartheid, and really it was the artists who had led the discussion to become a global one. And they just played such a critical role, both in holding up a mirror to society of what the world was and what it actually looked like, as well as being able to serve as a telescope to be able to show us really a different way and a way we could reimagine things. And it really does take arts and culture, I think, to do this. So we originally put this together to consider this in the context of recovery efforts around COVID-19, which of course have been hitting so hard and hitting particularly communities of color. But can imagine after the events of last week that people are also considering this in the context of racial justice. And these conversations, of course, are not separate. They're about power and visibility and dignity. And we have seen arts help us confront things and see things from perspectives that were previously invisible to us, motivate us, and helping us heal. So arts are a really powerful force in movement making. So this was Claire's brainchild, my colleague at Spitfire. So I'm going to hand it over to her to say more about why we are called to explore this topic. Claire?
Yeah, thank you. So it's nice to meet everyone. My name is Claire De Leon. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a director with Spitfire, and I'm in Long Beach, California right now. And this discussion really came together from a conversation with a trusted partner, Sabiha, who's on the panel today. And she and I were talking about the role that art will play when we're thinking about rebuilding and redesigning the systems that we need for a truly just society. And I fell asleep last night thinking about that and thinking about the discussion this morning, you know, while listening to helicopters overhead in Long Beach, very aware of the police state that we're in. And while we're in that moment, we're also in a moment that's been really hard fought for by movements over generations, where real shifts in power are at our doorstep. Because, you know, deep and painful injustices have been laid bare right now, from a pandemic where racism is a pre-existing condition to state-sanctioned murder. And power is invisible. That's part of, you know, the tricky part of dismantling it. So as I was thinking about this conversation and this moment that we're in, I wanted to share Audre Lorde quote that I love. And the quote is, you know, Audre Lorde asks us, what are the words you do not yet have? And that's where I see art come in, because art has played a particular role in raising my consciousness to the injustices that I felt in my bones that didn't even have the words to describe. And we can't build something new without envisioning it first. So today we want to talk about the why and the how of all this. Why in this moment we need art for movements, for strategic communication, and for challenging the racist structures that hold people down. Well, we're building new systems that serve people. And given that urgency, how artists and philanthropy can work best together in community and as partners. So I'm really eager to hear from our panelists as we envision what we need now and hear how to come together in community to make it real.
Terrific, thank you, Claire. So we do have with us today three people who can talk about this issue from different perches. Sabiha is coming to us from the Design Action Collective. Javier is coming in from the Sterdna Foundation, and Ashley is coming in from the Highlander Research Center. And we're really excited to get to hear from each of them. So what we asked was for them to just actually get to share with us what they think is important for us to know about this in this moment for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion of what this brings up for you, those of you that are on the phone. So let me start off with Sabiha and have her kick off for us.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It's an honor to be on this panel with the rest of you and be in conversation this morning for me here in Oakland. So I wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about my Shop Design Action Collective and where we feel we have been useful and what questions we're struggling with now. So Design Action Collective was founded by two members of Inkworks Press, which was a worker-owned cooperative print shop that was started in Berkeley in the late 70s, specifically to support revolutionary organizing and make sure that the people owned the presses because you couldn't get a lot of your really radical work printed just anywhere in those days. So then this was responding to a need that Design Action also carried forward, but Inkworks was a really amazing space. They have since closed after over 40 years on operation, being a majority of women and people of color owned and operated space. Design Action was founded on the same principles, being unionized, worker-owned, with explicit political points of unity. And we really blur the lines between us as designers, web developers, kind of professional visual communications consultants for hire, and the work that we do in our activism. So we are very much part of the movements that we are serving and try and model our values in the way we run our shop by being democratically owned and operated. We come to this work with an analysis around what we're up against when we talk about messaging, knowing that corporations like Wells Fargo and Chevron position themselves as the champions of working class people of color in this country. And that our stories, our struggles are co-opted and sold back to us in the form of corporate clothing and branding. And even when our stories and our struggles are captured in Hollywood films or high school history books, they're often stripped of these mass movements that made them and simplified down into one singular figurehead, keeping with that culture of celebrity. But who better than we to tell our own stories? And this is really the approach of Design Action Collective. When we came to the work around supporting hashtag Black Lives Matter, we were able to do so and create this logo because Alicia, Patrice, and Opal were friends of members of the shop. We'd worked together for years. We built that trust over time. So when this hashtag popped off, they knew that they could trust their friends in this collective to make something useful in the moment. And we were able to kind of reach into our toolbox of visual stylings that we knew would be effective for a sign that would be readable on camera, easy to recreate and reproduce. Inkworks Press, still in operation back then, printed many copies of this sign pretty much within 24 hours so they could be distributed really quickly. The image itself was made for free download that spread across social media as well. And in the hands of a leaderful movement, that brand really evolved and the visual logo took on new shapes and new details, but all held together with a visual vocabulary that continues to today. It came back full circle. Design Action created the website for blacklivesmatter.com, and by then this has been the new logo that was actually recreated by another Black designer in the movement. Another case study I wanted to share was when Donald Trump was announcing his first Muslim ban. Design Action members were in conversation with immigrant rights activists around the country, and understanding that this concept of opposing the ban being tied to opposing the militarization of the southern border was really the key part of how we were going to intervene in this moment and make sure that we wouldn't let our communities be divided that we couldn't show up against a ban without also bringing a story of a sanctuary for all people. And so when we took over the airports the next, literally like the next day after this poster is created, we were able to center that message and make sure that the most impacted people were the ones whose voices were centered. And all of the media coverage of the San Francisco airport action, even the New York action, featured this message. And we were able to help control the narrative, at least in the days that really surrounded the airport actions. And over the course of days, people came back to the airports with their own version of that poster. Another thing that Design Action works on is trying to train our fellow community members on how to create banners and create effective camera-ready visuals so that we can stay in formation when we are in the streets together. So that means trainings on screen printing, clear lettering, and the act of art making together is part of community organizing. It's part of making sure that we contextualize that in political education. Why are we writing this message, first of all? Where does it come from? Getting our hands on the materials. And then when we are in the streets, we recognize each other. We know why we're there. And that builds safety, and it also builds power. And more recently, in the age of COVID-19, still trying to figure out creative ways to offer art. Design Action members made this, this art piece that was actually became part of a coloring book that Bay Rising distributed. And these kinds of pieces as well were distributed over the course of the weekend, both for digital media, Zoom backgrounds, phone backgrounds, but also printable that folks actually printed and taped onto their cars during the caravans that took place in different cities yesterday. So I wanted to share those pieces partly because I'm really excited about doing this work and we have a range of art that can be offered. But just to ask the question to everybody here of where are we investing in our tools, like what tools work well, what tools need to shift in this moment, and how are we actually resourcing our movements to make sure that art is really central to the way that we're working versus something tangential or something kind of considered after the fact.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
That could not be the better transition to Javier. Then Javier, how are we resourcing our work to make sure art is at the center of it?
Well, that's tough to follow, Via. It was really great to see all of your work, and I'm so grateful to be in this conversation with all of you. I'll start really simply by saying the events of the last several weeks are weighing really heavily on me and on us. The complexity that we are faced with is not a binary. It's not a simple yes or no. And, you know, I was really grateful to be able to take some time this weekend to speak with my preteen and teenage nephews and helping them make sense of what's happening in the world and how people can educate themselves and get involved in the different aspects of this work. I'm going to quickly go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here, share. Hopefully you all can see my slide. Thanks to Bia for the head nod and Claire for the thumbs up. Cerna Foundation is a 102-year-old foundation. It is a family foundation that was founded and continues to be governed by the 5th generation of the family. We do our work as a social justice foundation that centers racial justice in our work in order to collaborate with frontline leaders and partners to build a racially just society that is characterized by equitable economies, sustainable environments, and thriving cultures. I have the benefit of being the director of the Thriving Cultures program, and at a high level, you know, the strategy that I have the privilege of overseeing invests in artist-led cultural strategies that generate the collaboration and imagination necessary for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to build and thrive in racially just communities across the U.S. This work for us started in 2018 when the foundation underwent a process where all programs were asked to clarify their strategies and articulate how they would know that they were making progress towards explicit goals. Through that process, our program identified racial justice as an anchor for all of our work. And as a result, the board decided at that time to include racial justice as a core tenet of all of our work. They also, at the time, developed an institutional first ever theory of change and set of objectives that include working towards increased democratic participation, increased public and private accountability, and increased wealth building opportunities by, to, and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In the Thriving Cultures program, we know that resistance work is important. And we also had to recognize that with the limited resources that we particularly steward, we didn't believe that our most strategic investment would be focused on supporting resistance work in the field. Our strategy as a result has been designed as a world building strategy and really seeks to cultivate and, as Sabia was saying, to resource our communities to get clear about what we want to build in order to dramatically and radically transform our society and no longer carry forward the racism that's been embedded in the DNA of this country since its founding. We organize our work, as you see in this sort of graph, and I'm not going to go into all of the details, across 3 strategic approaches that we call create, clarify, and connect, that you'll see in these sort of colored ovals. You see them here sort of in parallel form. We often talk about them as concentric circles with create as the center of our strategy. Our work under create primarily invests in intermediaries that support Black, Indigenous, people of color, artists to imagine, experiment, and prototype racially just systems and structures at a local scale. We fundamentally believe that our responsibility is to put money into the hands of community-based leaders of color that tend to always have an artistic practice when we think about movement building and about transformation at a local and national scale. We believe it's our responsibility to resource these artists and these community members in the same way that we've seen white communities be resourced for generations, which means that we must invest at a large scale over a long period of time with a research and development approach that has an expectation that somewhere between 80 and 95% of what we try will likely not work, but that we're designed in such a way that there is an opportunity for us to learn quickly, adapt, be distributed with our leadership, and then continue to develop more strategic efforts moving forward. Our Clarify approach then takes the learning and the ideation that happens through our create investments, and it produces research and criticism that helps disseminate the ideas generated by the artists and our partners under our create funding initiatives. Finally, under Connect, we have a series of funding programs that approach the ideas that seek to link the ideas of artists and the knowledge created by researchers and the critics to social movements and policymakers and funders that make systemic and structural change a reality. There's a lot more that I can say about the 8 individual funding initiatives underneath. I think we can hear more strategically and more concretely how this resourcing happens with our partner, Ash, who is the co-executive director of the Highlander Center for Research and Education based in Newmarket, Tennessee, who've really been important and critical partners in helping us both develop the strategy, understand how to provide the funding, and also understand how we use our privilege and power beyond the dollars to make sure that we are both blocking and tackling for communities, and to give us the honest feedback that we need to figure out how we enter into more equitable relationships with our partners and not leverage the financial resources that we have as somehow more valuable than the work that's happening on the ground. So excited to be able to hand off to Ash to talk more about how they have been generationally leading and supporting CERDNA and trying to advance some of this work.
Great, thanks Javier. Ashley.
Word. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashley Woodard Henderson. My homies call me Ash. I use she, her pronouns or anything said respectfully. I'm a Black, queer, from the working class, Afro-Latin Southern woman. And my people are storytellers and singers, they're preachers and pastors, they're drunks and drug addicts and gangbangers and revolutionaries, country bumpkins and city slickers. And I happen, because of all of those people, to be an activist and organizer, a cultural organizer at that, and a popular educator who has the privilege and responsibility of being the first Black woman executive director of the historic Highlander Research and Education Center in Tennessee, as Javier mentioned. We've been bringing people together across difference to figure out how to save the world since 1932. And we're still doing that work in a 21st century capacity. So I'm gonna definitely talk about the Surdna work, but as a person who's been perpetually pissed off at anti-Black racism and white supremacy since 1985, I feel like it's important to ground what we're doing with Surdna in this very immediate moment, like what is happening literally like outside of probably all of our doors. I think it would be not the practice of a cultural organizer to fly through that. So I just want to remind, like, to the question of why we need art for movement and how, in this bit of introduction, I just want to say a couple of quotes that resonate to me that have been answers to this question for a really long time. The first thing I thought when I heard the question was like what Tony Cade Bambaros said, right? That the role of an artist is to make the revolution irresistible. I also thought about Albert Einstein, who I don't think most people would identify as an artist, who said the revolution introduced me to art. And then in turn, art introduced me to the revolution. And I think that's our work. But I think what Highlander has done and why we started to be in deep relationship with Surdna around this work is that Highlander for decades, based on the work of Black women in the South in particular, have been doing work called cultural organizing. And when we talk about cultural organizing, we think of it as a triad, like a triangle, right? So one plank of that is art and culture, right? Which are not the same thing, right? You can be a creator and not be an artist. You can be an artist and not be a culture bearer or a culture builder, right? Those are three different things. But art and culture on one side, faith and spirit at the bottom. It got whitewashed in the 21st century to be like holistic wellness, but we're reclaiming faith and spirit because we said what we meant. And then the third plank is policy and practice, right? So if we put the triad together, instead of these segregated pieces, we believe at Highlander that if you take art and culture and pair it with faith and spirit, you can change policy and practice. And we train people by the thousands on how to do that, along with popular education and intergenerational organizing, place-based organizing, language justice, participatory action research, and the like, other methodologies for learning. We're a school. And so when we heard and got hit up by Javier and Robert from Surdna about this work, this experiment, this attempt at innovation, this opportunity for building not just transactional, but transformative relationships between not only capacity building organizations and artists and communities that are impacted by that art or that organizing, and a funder, we found it to be an opportunity not only for philanthropic organizing to pull Surdna to the left around what it means to actually be in some sort of democratic relationship with movements and organizations that are doing art and coordinating artists, but we also knew that this was an opportunity for us to invest a significant amount of resources into the communities that are most directly impacted by art as gentrification, by art as a tool of misinformation and poor education of people to support the systems that are actually harming them, which goes back to what Sabia was noticing earlier. So would just say that our hope in this project is to actually not only invest in the artists who are out of work right now, who are trying to figure out how to connect their work to communities that are desperately needing their attention and their creations, but also to support the grassroots communities who have been disinvested in and that could use artists and creators and culture bearers to actually envision what practicing liberation, practicing freedom in real time looks like. And I think that is why we need art for movement right now.
Ashley, can you say the pillars again? People didn't catch the pillars. Can you just talk us through those again?
Yep, absolutely. So it's a triangle, it's a triad. One plank of the triad is art and culture. Art and culture, right? The bottom is faith and spirit. Some people may have heard that as holistic wellness, but that's not what the culture bearers that created this methodology said. They said faith and spirit. That's what they meant, right? And that could be in connection with a faith practice, but also if you've ever been in a march and said, ain't no power like the power of the people because the power of the people don't stop. If you've ever said, I believe that we will win, that is a declaration of faith because you do not have any tangible evidence to prove that shit is true, right? You can't taste it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it, you can't hear it, you can't necessarily see it. You're saying that you believe in something that is not yet manifested, right? So art and culture on one plane, faith and spirit at the bottom, right? And if you don't think that it's spirit, let me tell you, when Nazis tried to burn down my office in March of 2019, they were trying to break our spirit. They were trying to stop our work through scaring us and freezing us up because our spirits were broken. They failed, right? It's faith and spirit work. So art and culture, faith and spirit, policy and practice is the third, right? We don't believe in art and culture for art and culture's sake, right? We don't live in the world that should be where it can just be that. That's what we're building towards. So we have to be shifting policies and practices to be in right relationship with the communities who all too often are the inspiration for the art and the culture building in the first place, right? We cannot be in good conscience and in right relationship if the things that we're creating, if the art that we're manifesting, if the cultures that we're building are not useful and helpful to changing the systemic oppression that the communities that art and culture is coming out of are still having to deal with those systems, right? So we believe that if you take art and culture and pair it with faith and spirit, that you will absolutely necessitate the change of policy and practice. That's what we think. All three of those things are required to call it cultural organizing.
Great, thank you so much. And maybe, Ashley, I'll stay with you and we'll go backwards in order on this first question, which is that we're in a moment where shifts in power are palpable and we're seeing the inequities that have always been there laid bare by a global pandemic, by systemic racism, visible by the murder of George Floyd and other Black people. How can art play a role not only in raising consciousness about injustice, but as importantly in envisioning the just systems we need to create? So I guess I would really ask to think about the role around envisioning. And Ashley, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things. The first thing that I would say is that for folks who have been on the front lines, whether because they are like revolutionaries or organizers or activists, or because they're on the front lines because they're the most directly impacted by white supremacy or homophobia or transphobia or capitalism or ableism, all of the isms. So whether they're actively involved in movement building or not, they are still on the front lines. And that when you are constantly being impacted by police terrorism, by the terrorist that is Donald Trump, by all of the sort of flunkies that hide behind Trump, who actually have always been a problem in our communities, and the neoliberals that have allowed these systems to continue to hurt us, that sometimes because you're just trying to freaking survive, your revolutionary imagination, your ability to have radical visionary thoughts, your ability to dream, not only starts to feel like a luxury because that's what white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy tell us it is, right? That some of us don't get to dream, right? But also you're just fucking tired. And that the ability to actually have very long-term utopian visions about what the world should be feels like a luxury that some of us cannot afford. Now, quite frankly, I believe that without those visions, without like that imaginary muscle, which I think sometimes can be atrophied because of systemic oppression, not because of ability, that sometimes that what happens is we need someone's who can help us see something that doesn't yet exist, hear something else that doesn't exist, that can evoke a feeling that doesn't yet feel accessible to me, to my people, to my family, to my community. And so I think that the role of artists, of culture bearers, of creatives is to be able to help manifest that when everybody is like, man, I can't see it. Not because I don't want it, I just can't see it, right? If people say, like, I can't see abolition in practice, but you live in a white suburban upper middle class neighborhood where the cops don't show up because they don't feel that there's a threat, and you tell me that abolition is possible, I might not believe you when I have in South Atlanta teenagers who have experiences with the police 7 times a day, right?
Yeah.
Very literally, right? If I tell you that it's possible to defund police, that actually is possible, it could happen. But you know that like 2/3 of your municipal budget goes to policing because we believe that if we invest in more guns and bullets for police, that we'll get safer communities versus, you know, investing in the infrastructure of like family development centers and social workers and mental health, you know, ability to get to mental health services, et cetera. If I can't see it because that's not my reality, guess what an artist can do? Yeah. Guess what a creative can do? Guess what a songwriter or a poet can do? Guess what a culture builder, a storyteller can do, right? They can help me see what is not yet tangible. I think it's necessary. And let me just give you like a concrete example. One is that just today, in the last 48 hours, I don't know if there's any New Yorkers on the call. I tend to not talk about New York and California as a Southern supremacist. But for those of you that are my coastal elite friends that live in these places like New York, I just want to mention the good news that in the last 48 hours, people told the Movement for Black Lives, which I helped start along with a long list of other comrades. When we were talking about defunding the police 5 years ago, people said it was a crack dream, right? I want you to fast forward to within the last 48 hours, 5 incumbents in New York have donated and sworn off cop contributions. They've returned $26,500 to our people. 51 incumbents and $287,270 to go, but it's a shift. It's a shift that only became possible in the last 48 hours because the very Black people who would have not necessarily always believed that it could be possible burned shit down and said enough is enough and took up in the streets in peaceful protest, right? I'll give you another example that's a little more historic since you probably don't believe my contemporary one.
I believe it. I believe it.
You know, just in case. Anybody heard the song "We Shall Overcome"? Maybe once or twice. Have you ever been charged to sing it? Just to clarify, you've been charged. You've been charged like you paid a check to sing it. Probably not, right? Some of you maybe, but it's highly doubtful. Well, the song "We Shall Overcome" came out of communities that look and live like me. And that song then got copywritten by a couple of really well-intentioned white folks who were folk singers in the like 60s, 50s. What happened to correct that misstep that was done in all good faith to protect the song from people that were going to be opportunistic and pervert its purpose was that the Highlander Center became charged with holding that money, and an independent committee was put together to re-grant the royalties from "We Shall Overcome" to Black communities in the South that were doing work at the nexus of art and activism, right? Well, recently, y'all might have seen that "We Shall Overcome" got put in the public domain. Did anybody hear about that? Well, it did. There was a big, nasty lawsuit about it. And people were like, yeah, like "We Shall Overcome" should be in the public domain. It should be in the public domain. And it was like, well, like I didn't ever know that "We Shall Overcome" wasn't in the public domain. People have been singing and using it all the time, but we just wanted to make sure that like, if Ford wanted to say that the way that you overcome is by buying a F-150, that they couldn't do that without paying for it. And that the people who actually created the song got a say, right? I'll give you another concrete example, that pornographers couldn't use it to like promote Black and white people having sex together, particularly enslaved pornography, and then use the song "We Shall Overcome" as a backdrop to it. That's a literal example. And movement veterans got to block it. What's also real though is that there were artists like Lee Daniels, for example, with the movie Selma, who thought it a problem, probably because they didn't know that those royalties that they would have been paying or supporting Black movement on the ground in the South. And so they sued. They sued because they didn't want to pay for the song, right? So I think I raised that example as like artists can get it really right by listening to communities and following their leadership And then based on your inspiration, what your spirit moves you to do and what communities are saying, to do really, really incredibly revolutionary interventions in this moment. We need that. What we don't need is artists and culture bearers and creators that are not connected to grassroots communities and marginalized people making decisions about what's best with the cultural and artistic creations that are coming from community, right? We've seen lots of examples, whether it's Killer Mike at press conferences wearing a Kill Your Master shirt and then talking about how it's okay for police to kill Black people in Atlanta, and on and on and on, right? So there's this opportunity, there's this balance. And I think Serdna, the regranters, the folks in the PAR work, the participatory action research work, are trying to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to be in right relationship with each other and with the folks on the ground, to be intentional that we are not moving out of step and that we're moving in alignment with folks knowing their roles and playing it excellently for the sake of the next steps of what radical imagination around racial justice could be.
Yeah. So Ashley, you've raised some really important things. And Javier, I'd like to ask you to step into a few of these. So I hear Ashley talking about how important it is for people who have the dream muscle to get to use it, which obviously means resources. And at the same time, we're not hiring these people, right? Like when you're a philanthropist, like you got to kind of let them go with what they need to go with. And then it's also interesting of like, and then who owns that? You know, who, the creators, the movements they brought it to, like, how do you think about all of that? That's a super complicated way. So how do philanthropists play a good role here? But also at the same time, it sounds like it's got some risk for philanthropists. So like, how do you navigate all that?
So I'll start actually in reverse, Kristen. It's a great question. You know, philanthropy tries to address this issue of risk all the time. I tend to resist the idea of risk because there are no, in fact, real credible legal mechanisms that can remove the power or influence level of a philanthropy. So if a foundation makes an investment that the world doesn't like, what is somebody going to do? Send an email or make a phone call? It's probably not going to change the board. It's probably not going to change the staff or the leadership or the strategy. Folks are going to, you know, at the best, they're going to ask some questions and then they're going to keep it moving and do the things that they have been committed to doing in whatever format they want to do it. And so I think my feedback to anybody in the funding world is to really sort of continue to dive deeper in the questions around risk and what is it we're really risking and why are our reputations so precious. So that's thing one. Thing two, on the resourcing side, there are a couple of ways that we are approaching this work. First, when we think about how we resource the arts organizations that we are charging with collaborating with artists. One of the first things that we've done as a funder is to recognize that people aren't getting equal pay, and our social justice movements, there's a narrative about the need to work all the time, 7 days a week, burn the candle at both ends, when communities of color are already, and low-income communities are already under the brunt of anxiety and stress that leads to all kinds of other complicated problems. And so we've been working to create a narrative that's about rest, that's about vacations, not being a luxury, about literally creating line items for rest, relaxation, and therapy for the human beings that are carrying out this work, and then asking them further that they begin to see artists as strategy partners, not as producers of objects or performances, but really the thinkers, as Ash was talking about earlier, that are going to help us imagine a way out of all of this. One of the folks that I'll point to that it's really great at doing this as another example is a group called Intelligent Mischief. Amazing group or partnership between Terry and Aisha, really brilliant folks. And at a recent convening that we hosted around narrative change in January in Dallas, they sort of said one of the major challenges around imagining defunding police, for example, is that we're constrained by the way the world tells us things are supposed to operate. And we're still constrained when we think about, let's say 25 to 50 years out, when we can still see our children or our nieces and nephews in the world. And we're still constrained even 100 years out when we think about our grandchildren, because these are things that we can tangibly consider. We're all used to these family lineages. Their approach philosophically is often to say, can we start 200 or 300 years out where none of us can imagine ourselves or our descendants in the world, and then pull apart all the pieces? What is it going to look like? And when you can create that kind of radical vision that isn't controlled or constrained by the world and the objects and the narratives that we currently have, then we can begin to work our way backwards and think about, what is the thing that I can do today? What is the thing I can do in a year? What is the thing I can do in 5 years to continue to work towards that long-term goal? We often try and strategize around the immediate things that are happening now. And part of the way that we're looking to resource is, in fact, to get to that 200 or 300 year vision. The final piece that I'll say around how we're looking at funding is, again, understanding that the idea of a gig worker, which is most artists in the world, is fundamentally broken. It does not work. And so in the way in which we are working, for example, with our regranting partnerships that both Ash and I have talked about, there are 11 organizations funding all across the country, at least 85 projects a year over the course of the next 3 years. And we've required that at least 12% of every project budget that the regranters give to artists go to funding the whole human, which means they have to be focused on debt reduction, retirement savings, healthcare, vacations, and anything else that a human being fundamentally needs in order to do their work well. So that's a minimum of 12% that has to account for those. And then there's a national online wage calculator for artists based on the size and budget of an institution, the geography that they're in, and what the prevailing wage should be per hour. For the amount of time that each artist is anticipating. So we're trying to balance between what is equitable pay for the work that they're doing now and not looking at projects in an abstracted form of the humans that are enacting them, and making sure that we're sort of holistically resourcing folks in that way. So while we are walking that walk, we then simultaneously, on the other side of our strategy, are working with other philanthropies on a local and national scale to share the model, to talk about how we cannot say that artists need to be these change makers if we're not willing to redress the way that philanthropy has generationally and systemically underfunded communities of color and artists as an entire sector, and arts organizations as well. So those are the ways in which we're doing it, or some of the ways in which we're looking at it. And I'll stop there.
Great. Well, I'd love to build on that and take it over to Sabiha. So what I'm hearing from you, Javier, is, we have to really think about this from a resource question, and it's time, it's compensation, it's like the climate and conditions to actually be able to do this critical work. And I'm sort of interested more in the process. So I sort of listened to you talk about Black Lives Matter and how you created, and I think in some people's mind, like as a strategic communicator and as a narrative person myself, I think we sort of think about, well, I'm going to think about the strategy, I'm going to think about the words, and then I'll bring the visual person in and they'll create a logo, right? And of course, that's nothing like a logo. This is like what you just showed us was like, you created a rallying cry, you created a mindset, you created a way of being that you said at some point that we would know each other when we were out there. And so as a symbol of recognition to each other. So if you had to share with us today, like, how do you think about that process so that you're bringing artists in with you at the right time, you're giving them the freedom, the space, but even like, how do you even say to somebody, here's how to actually work in partnership in a productive manner? So I'm interested in that, and then I'll ask if there's others that want to jump in on that one too.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I just want to plus one everything Ash and Javier said. Really, speaking to also the question of our radical imaginations, and then in the practical purposes of resourcing ourselves. Being a working artist is a hustle, and we're constantly uncertain and unstable in our financial realities. And so one of the ways that Design Action Collective has tried to address that is by organizing ourselves as a worker-owned cooperative and trying to model our anti-capitalist values in the way that we're setting up our working relationships with each other and with our, for lack of a better term, clients. And again, trying to to blur the line between the vendor-client relationship, which often can be somewhat tense or adversarial, even about negotiating budgets and timelines and kind of squeezing the worker in order to achieve the cause, the goal. Like we have to do it for the cause, and we have to kind of self-exploit in order to deliver. And that kind of internalized worker exploitation is something that the worker co-op model tries to flip. And so one way we do that is by making sure that we have set up systems that we planned from a place of abundance. So again, to Javier's point about looking at ourselves as whole people and imagining what it looks like when we don't have all of those constraints that we're constantly up against. What is the version of this shop working relationship, working with each other, working with our movements that feels healthy, that allows us to thrive, and allows us to then have some longevity in this work and kind of embrace the lifelong practice of being part of the resistance versus this kind of sprint to burnout.
Yeah.
So we all make decisions democratically. We all pay ourselves the same wage, but we look at ways to build in benefits, family leave, healthcare, vacation. When we first were founded, we couldn't afford to do any of that. But fast forward 16 years now, we have been. We're still struggling because living in the Bay Area is very expensive, but and we want to make our work accessible to our folks, and so we try and create a sliding scale. We do a fair amount of pro bono work, and where we can work with folks that have budgets, that subsidizes the other work. So we try and figure it out, even like on a week by week, month by month basis of how we keep this work going and check in with each other and care for each other, all while trying to be accountable to the most impacted people and not falling into the kind of practices that are all too prevalent around appropriation, co-optation, even by well-intentioned artists in our movements. We can have missteps all the time. So how do we make sure that we are really checking in on accountability there too? And another area that I think we can be useful is by organizing other artists and designers who are newly politicized, because in the age of Trump, a lot of designers, even in the San Francisco kind of tech spaces, are asking, what can I do? And I'm delighted to be able to say, like, yes, welcome, and here's what everybody else is already doing, and you can just fund that or boost that, and it's not about you coming up with a new original idea here. So that's been an interesting place where Design Action gets to kind of live in our industry space and our movement space. But to your question about process and partnership, the most successful partnerships, creative partnerships we've had that have had the biggest impact is really when we've been able to be in the conversations around goals early on and build some of that trust, so that by the time it does get to, well, what does that mark look like? What colors and fonts and photo pairings are we gonna put on blast, in what format? Those decisions are based on a foundational, like, trust-built, shared analysis. And then the visuals actually come fairly easily and quickly. And we're not getting stuck in kind of too many detail tweaking of like, oh, should we change this shade of blue to this shade of blue? And as someone who loves to geek out about graphic design, I would happily spend a day thinking about different shades of blue in the space between two letters. And I look at some of the work like that I showed you even in my slides of, oh, if I'd had another day to work on that, I would have just refined that a little bit more. But I also come from organizing, and it doesn't matter how perfect that is if it's late. The campaign's happening now, and we want it to be effective. We want to be proud of it, and we want to celebrate it. We want folks to be excited to put that on their shirt or carry that and feel joy from it too. But we want it to be efficient and the work to be cared for, and we want the folks that are using it to feel excited about it. So yes, when Design Action members get to be part of those earlier conversations, when there's funding to actually pay us for our time so that we can be in those meetings. Otherwise it might be like, all right, well, you figure that out and then we'll come in later and we'll just do this little section of it because that's the only amount of time and resources that are available. And we can't afford to donate additional time this month on being in those meetings. So we're constantly kind of figuring that out. But if we have a little more spaciousness in our relationships and in our project planning, that allows artists to step up even more and shed a little bit of that like scarcity anxiety around whether we can afford to put our time here or there. And so that would be my wish, is that we always have build in more and more of that planning.
Terrific. Do you want to tag to that, Javier? You sound like you wanted to go.
Yeah, I wanted to, Sabia, I really appreciate your thoughts. And I think what you brought me back to was sort of Christian's comment about like, we're not hiring these people full-time necessarily, but I wanted to sort of share that there are some examples where that is the case. So I think about our sister foundation, Nathan Cummings, that many years ago created an annual fellowship that was about supporting artists. And at first they were requiring them to live in New York City, but gave a decent sort of size or amount of money to support people for a year. They've now sort of removed the geographic requirement, and they're supporting artists sort of quasi as staff members. They get a $150,000 stipend for 18 months. They're allowed to work on a project that in particular, its goals are aligned with the mission of the organization, but don't have to be in lockstep. And what they ask is that the artists actually do carve out space and time to work from the foundation whenever possible, because the foundation understands that its work internally in its operations and its work as a grant maker and external sort of programming partner can only be strengthened with that kind of creative vision and activity at the center. And so that leads me to imagine, what about if each of our organizations fundamentally understood and can create and see the value of investing in creative individuals at the center of our operations and programs, for someone to really help us step out of the box of what we're used to seeing. The other sort of loop I wanted to close, because I know that Ash wants to jump in as well, and I want to make sure she has space to share her thoughts. I think we've talked a lot about the strategic communications component of the narrative work, which is critical and necessary. And part of our investment strategy also looks at how does the strategic communication and campaign work make sure that it's absolutely connected and at least coordinated with the cultural power building that's happening and organizing in communities across the country. And then all the way up, connected to the journalism and criticism that's happening in the papers and the meta-narrative work and journalism, and then connected also to some of the pop culture work where folks are organizing in writers' rooms in Hollywood, so that our mainstream sort of media is helping us really change our mental models and recognizing that we don't have to work from scarcity because there is enough for everybody. And that we don't have to just care for ourselves, that we have to understand our interdependence, and that it's important that if something happens to you, that I speak out. So I think that there's lots of opportunity, and I'm seeing sort of philanthropy beginning in its own way to experiment and create opportunities for people to see the role that artists can play really as full-time employees outside of individual producers, for folks that are interested in the field.
Yeah, I love that. I love that whole new way of thinking about it. I myself will not be doing any more narrative work where I always think to hire some researchers and have never thought to hire an artist at the top of it. So that will happen. Ash, can you maybe take us home with last comment here on, where would you've been in this work a long time, you know philanthropies, if you were sort of to say to them like, hey, this is really where you can make a big difference in how you're funding this, where you're putting the thumb on the scale here, what would you say to infuse more arts into movement making?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, and I'll try to do it quickly because I want to respect you all's time and get back to the rebellion. I would say a couple of things. One is I don't like false dichotomies. They're not useful. And so what I would say is like, even before philanthropy got hip to the game that artists actually matter and that movements don't move without art, communities were like buying mixtapes out of people's trunks, and you know, people were selling their paintings on the street and folks were putting in what they could put in. Like communities always, the movement and philanthropy messes up right relationship. Communities and artists have been in intimate relationship and interdependence for as long as people have existed. So I would say like this, we're not like starting something new. We're starting to like replicate and reclaim what communities have done well for forever. And that's also a false dichotomy, because what's also real is people are people. They mess up every day. And so I certainly do. Let me speak for my damn self. And so there have been days where sometimes like people showed up for artists and made sure that they could pay their bills and feed their kids and put money in the bank and pay off their debts. And there have been days where we're like, listen, can you just get me the goddamn graphic? Both things are true. It will continue to be forever. That's the world we're in. Until capitalism doesn't exist, people are going to get exploited. And sometimes that's going to be by good people. And if that stops you from doing the work, then what are you doing? Quite frankly, you know, my mama never got paid to do movement work, just to be real. So I think yes, we want to build a world where everybody has what they need and some, because I believe that like socialists deserve nice things. But what's also real, right, is that we don't live there yet. And it's going to require some of us to make some sacrifice to get there. So if I was talking, that's what I would say to other artists, creatives, culture bearers. If I was talking to philanthropy, what I would say is cut the check and get out of the way, right? Like, yes to all the strategic partnerships. Yes, like I love Javier and I cuss him out on a regular basis. Like, yes to a transformative relationship between communities and artists and philanthropy, and like reparations now, right? Give us the money so that folks cannot, so artists, so activists, so communities cannot be stressed out about the daily. And quite frankly, the way that I would say that you can get out of the way, because I know that's callous, and if I don't give you the nuance of strategy, you'll think that I'm just telling, you know, Javier to cut millions of dollars and that we don't have to be accountable for it, which is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there is no way for movements or artists to hold philanthropy accountable to anything, period. It doesn't exist, right? In a system like that, like what we've inherited. So what we can do, right, is be intentional and say that if I already had money, right? So for example, starting to cut this check a minute ago, right? And it doesn't mean that because of this moment, all of the sort of ways that we had agreed that we would get this money go out of the window. But what it does mean is like the conditions have significantly shifted. So certain might not get what we thought we were going to get in 2020 in 2020, right? And it means knowing that like the people that know what is possible the best are the people that are doing the damn work, right? And because folks had access, because artists had gotten access to these resources, because communities have access to these resources, because capacity building organizations and base building organizations had access to these resources, they're not spinning out around rapid response or recovery, right? They had the money in the bank already. And if philanthropy could be intentional about using their limited resources, and I'm going to say limited in a very liberal way, right? Because it's actually like cents on the dollar of what we deserve. But if they could use their limited resources to create that sense of spaciousness and abundance that Sabia was talking about earlier, then these rapid response moments would actually be me solely focused on just helping to support people who are currently in the streets and not giving advice to philanthropy in the moment of uprising, what they should be doing with the money that actually my people helped create in the first place, right? So what does it look like to cut these checks in a way that gives movement and artists enough wiggle room that they can be innovative, they can be experimental, they can fail. White people get to fail all the time. Trump is the story of white mediocrity, right? They get to fail all the time. What does it look like to give some spaciousness to movements to fail up, right? To learn up, artists to create, and even if it gets like 10 likes, right? Yeah. If it's making this political intervention, right? I think this is the moment where we can say, what is the political and educational and artistic intervention that we are trying to make? What is the recipe for art and culture to build revolutionary change in this time? And I think that artists need to answer that. I think communities need to answer that. And I definitely think philanthropy does.
Great. I think that is a perfect thing to end on. I really want to thank all three of our panelists today. A gift to get to hear from you. I know everybody needs to get back to rebellion and revolution and the many things that you are working on. And we appreciate all of your time today and everybody who joined us. We'll share these notes. We'll share the triangle. And I hope everybody has a productive day today. Thank you.